What was the most important congressional election in United States history? Hi, my name is Jason, and welcome to Founder of the Day. Today we're going to talk about what, in my opinion, is the most important congressional race in American history. Let's start out by saying there are hundreds of cases where campaigns can be argued to be more important than this. Sure, but this is a show about the American Revolution, so that's what we're going to talk about. And in my opinion, the most important congressional election was that of 1789 in Virginia's 5th District, which, if you are paying attention, is the inaugural race for the United States House of Representatives. And what's very interesting about this is the two men running against each other would both end up being President of the United States of America. So let's take it back a little bit. James Madison, a scrappy young man who's making a little bit of a name for himself on the internet, on the national scene, before there was a national scene, in the Congress of the Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, him and another lesser known at the time young man, Alexander Hamilton, somehow finagle a bunch of guys to get together in Philadelphia and write a new constitution. And they say, hey, let's overthrow this old government and replace it with this new one. But we're going to be gentlemanly about it, and our overthrow will be sending it to the individual states to have the citizens vote for representatives to ratify it. So this all happens, and when James Madison goes back to Virginia to try and ratify the Constitution, there's a very popular politician who's just coming off being governor, who he really expects to be on his side. And this man is Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry is most certainly not on his side. Henry is one of the leaders, not only in the country, but more notably in Virginia, which at the time was the most important state in the Union. It had the most income. I believe it had the largest population. And it was number one. Now, as a leader in Virginia, Henry became an anti-federalist. So he and Madison kind of had it out at the convention. Fortunately, in a very close race, the Constitution was accepted by Virginia. Now, Henry was still a very influential politician, and at the time, during the inaugural selection of candidates, the United States Senate was chosen directly by the state governments. Not like today. It wasn't until the early 1900s that the people actually voted for who was going to be senator. So at the time, Henry was influential, and James Madison really thought he was going to be a senator. He just helped write this new Constitution, and he wanted to go help start this new government. Fortunately for him, Patrick Henry had other ideas, and he was able to finagle it, even for lack of a better term, so that Madison was not given a seat in the Senate. So James had to go do the next best thing. He ran for House of Representatives from the 5th District, where his house was. So Patrick Henry decided to run a candidate of his own. First of all, when they made the electoral districts, very influential Patrick Henry tried to, I don't want to say rig it, but gerrymander it before gerrymandering was a term, because Elbridge Gerry was still a favored politician in the North at the time. Just to note, he always would be. And in hindsight, Elbridge Gerry was an American hero. we will get to that in another video. But Henry, in so many words, gerrymandered the state so that Madison could not win. Well, it turns out James Madison went out to campaign, and the person he was running against was someone Henry chose. Another name you might recognize, James Monroe. So yes, the eventual 4th and 5th presidents of the United States ran against each other, one of which, James Monroe, was on an, I don't want to say anti-federalist ticket because the Constitution had passed, but a very anti-federalist's ticket. And it was an extremely close race, because keep in mind, Henry had basically gerrymandered the district in Monroe's favor. But James Madison Along the way, which I should note at the time, as often happened, they were opponents, but they had been friends for a long time. They were both disciples of Jefferson by now, and they would ride in carriages together to go debate one another. It was a very civilized time. Um, but along the way, James Madison realized that in order for him to win, he would need to promise the number one thing most of the states were clamoring for, which was a Bill of Rights. Because most of the individual states had a Bill of Rights at this point, so the idea that the federal government wouldn't have a Bill of Rights was not, most people were unhappy with that. And along the way, he realized that it would be the best thing, not just to win the election. First and foremost, it was to win the election, but secondly, if done properly, as Madison said. It's done, I will paraphrase his quote, I don't remember it directly, but if done in a proper way, modestly, then it could serve to protect the people and the states from the federal government. Very important note that we wanted to protect the states from the federal government. The same, if not more than, protecting the people from it. So, they're running, and at one point Madison does pledge to push for a Bill of Rights. And it was this pledge, plus his knowledge of the Constitution, and his just general knowledge of how government works. He might not have been the best speaker, but neither really was Monroe, who was really a newcomer to politics at the time. And Madison was able to squeak out a victory in this election. And this is monumental, because he goes on to be he has a very strange place in the first administration. You know, Washington becomes president, and famously Hamilton's treasurer and Jefferson's Secretary of State, and they have their famous divide. But Madison, who worked so closely with Hamilton as Continental Congressman, and then at the Annapolis Convention, and then at the Constitutional Convention, now that there is a federal government, they start to realize they have very strong divides. But Madison is still looked at by even President Washington as a very influential member of that first government. He was probably, from my perspective, in my opinion, one of the 2 or 3 most important people in the first House of Representatives. Because keep in mind, we like to say Washington set all these precedents as president. Well, all the senators who were inaugural senators set precedents for the Senate, and all the delegates in the House of Representatives who were inaugural congressmen set precedents. And James Madison played a humongous role in setting precedents that still linger today. From there, of course, both Madison and Monroe would find themselves falling in with Jefferson for the Democratic-Republican Party. And so Jefferson, after Madison would spend 8 years in the House of Representatives, the entire Washington administration. He would leave for the Adams administration, but then famously came back as Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson for 8 years, and then he would become President of the United States for 8 years of his own. And while he's president, James Monroe, once his opponent in the first congressional race for United States House of Representatives, James Monroe would act for a time as Secretary of War during the War of 1812, and for a time as Secretary of State for James Madison. And Secretary of State was very important because nowadays we might think, oh, whoever's vice president is next in line, quote unquote, next in line to be president. Back then, Secretary of State was the most important position if you wanted to be the next president. For example, Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. Excuse me. And it just is an extraordinarily important election. As I said, they both went on to be President of the United States, but when Madison was in the House of Representatives, he kept his promise. Imagine that. A politician who keeps his promise. He changed his mind and made a promise, which was to write the Bill of Rights. And although other people did play a role, there were other people. I like to note Roger Sherman, with certain freedoms we were given. But there were several people who did play a role in crafting them, and James Madison was the primary author of the Bill of Rights. And again, it all falls back to one early race for House of Representatives between two future presidents. So that's all we have for today. I hope you enjoyed that story. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, give it a like. It'll help more people randomly fall onto this channel, and we can see what we can grow. And if you liked it, please subscribe. That way you can get notifications if you hit the bell next time I'm producing a video. Thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you tomorrow.